The early morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the wide, endless plains of Texas. The grass waved softly in the cool breeze, and a few scattered clouds floated lazily in the pale sky. On the far edge of a dusty trail, a wagon creaked and rattled as it made its slow journey westward. Inside sat a young woman clutching two tiny babies to her chest, twin girls wrapped in worn blankets that had seen better days. Her name was Clara Mae, and she had lost nearly everything except the two miracles she held in her arms. Clara had buried her husband only 3 weeks earlier. Fever had taken him suddenly, leaving her alone in a land that showed no mercy. She had nowhere to go, no money, and no kin. The nearest town was 30 miles behind her, and the next ranch was rumored to belong to a man so big, so quiet, and so feared that few dared approach his gates. Folks called him the Giant Rancher, though his real name was Garrett Boone. When Clara's wagon wheel snapped halfway down a rocky slope, she knew her journey had ended. The axle broke clean, the horse limped, and the sun was sinking fast. The twins began to cry, their little faces red and scrunched. Clara felt her throat tighten as she stared at the wide empty horizon. The wind picked up, whispering across the plain like the sigh of something ancient. She dropped to her knees beside the wagon, clutching her babies close. "Lord," she whispered, "please, help us." She didn't know if anyone heard her prayer. But as twilight fell, she saw a shape moving across the ridge, a man on horseback, tall as a mountain even from a distance. His shadow stretched long over the dying light, and for a moment, she wondered if it was an angel or a ghost. When he came closer, she saw the truth: broad shoulders, a thick coat of dust, a weathered hat, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He stopped his horse, looking down at the broken wagon, the frightened woman, and the crying twins. "You in trouble, ma'am?" His voice was deep, calm, and steady like the rumble of distant thunder. Clara rose slowly, clutching her babies tighter. "Yes, sir. The wheel's gone, and my horse's leg is bad. I got nowhere else to go." The man dismounted in one smooth motion, towering over her. "You got little ones with you," he said, glancing at the twins. "That makes things different. You'll come with me. My ranch ain't far." Her instinct told her not to trust strangers, especially men. But something in his tone left no room for doubt or fear. He lifted one of the babies gently in his arms, almost awkwardly, as though he'd never held something so small. The baby stopped crying. That was enough for Clara. They rode under the fading stars until a faint glow appeared ahead, a massive house of timber and stone surrounded by open fields, fences, and the faint lowing of cattle. The ranch seemed alive even in the dark. Lanterns flickered in the windows, and dogs barked near the barn. When they reached the porch, a housekeeper rushed out, gasping. "Mr. Boone, what on earth?" "She'll need a room," Garrett interrupted. "And some milk for the young'uns." Inside, the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. Clara hadn't felt safe in months, but something about that place, the heavy beams, the sound of a clock ticking, the quiet strength of the man who had rescued her, made her feel like she could breathe again. The housekeeper, Miss Annie, took the babies to warm them by the fire while Clara sat down, trembling with exhaustion. Garrett stood nearby, silent. "You got a name, ma'am?" he finally asked. "Clara Mae," she said softly. "My husband was Daniel Mae. He's gone now." Garrett nodded slowly, his eyes full of something unspoken. "You're welcome to stay until you get your bearings. I don't let no woman and babies freeze on my land." Days passed, and the ranch came alive with the rhythm of life, cattle moving in the fields, horses running, and men shouting orders. Clara helped Miss Annie in the kitchen, and though her hands were small, her work was steady. Garrett rarely spoke at length, but she saw him every morning, riding out before dawn, returning after sunset with dust in his beard and sun on his skin. He was a man made of silence and mountains, strong, enduring, and lonely. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain slashed against the windows, and thunder shook the roof. One of the twins, little Ella, fell ill, burning with fever. Clara panicked. "Please," she cried to Miss Annie, "she's burning up." Garrett appeared at the doorway. He didn't hesitate. He lifted the baby in his arms, barked orders to bring water and blankets, and stayed beside the bed all night. His huge hand looked almost absurd next to the tiny bundle, yet he was gentle as the rain outside. When dawn came, the fever broke. Clara wept silently, watching the man who had saved her child without saying a word of praise or comfort for himself. After that night, something changed. Garrett began to take his meals in the kitchen rather than alone in his study. Sometimes, He would sit quietly while Clara hummed to the twins. Once, when one of the babies reached for his hat, he smiled a real smile, shy and rare as rain in the desert. The men on the ranch noticed too. "Boss, you're gettin' soft," they teased. He only grunted, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Weeks turned into months. Clara began to find her place, cooking, mending, and keeping the house warm. She found herself watching Garrett from the window as he worked the land. There was a peace in him, buried deep beneath all that strength, and a loneliness she understood all too well. One evening, she found him repairing a fence post near the creek. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, approaching with a basket of food. "You missed supper." He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Didn't notice." She handed him a piece of bread and cheese. "You work too hard," she said. He took it silently, their fingers brushing for a heartbeat too long. They both froze. A sudden warmth filled the air, and the wind carried the sound of crickets through the grass. He looked at her then, not as the widow he'd rescued, but as a woman who had quietly brought light into his empty home. "You and those babies," he said slowly, "you've turned this place into something I can't rightly explain." Tears welled in her eyes. "You gave us a home, Garrett." He nodded. "Guess we both saved each other then." The ranch prospered that spring. The cattle grew fat, the fields green. Clara taught the twins to walk on the porch, their tiny hands gripping the railing. Garrett built them a swing in the oak tree, pretending he didn't care when they called him Papa. But every time they did, his face softened, and the ache that had lived inside him for years eased a little more. One morning, trouble came riding. 3 men from the nearby town arrived, rough-looking and armed. They claimed the land beyond the river was theirs. Garrett stood his ground. "This ranch has been Boone land for 20 years, he said calmly. The leader spat in the dirt. "Then maybe it's time someone else took it." Clara watched from the porch, her heart pounding. Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. But when one of the men reached for his gun, Garrett's hand moved faster. In one smooth motion, he shot the man's hat clean off his head. The message was clear. The men left without another word. That night, Clara found Garrett sitting alone in the barn, sharpening his knife. She approached quietly. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking. He looked up, his eyes dark. "Not while I've got someone worth protectin'." For a long moment, they said nothing. Then she stepped closer, her heart racing. "Garrett," she whispered, "we're not just guests anymore. This is our home too." He rose slowly, towering over her, the lantern light flickering between them. "You sure you want that, Clara Mae?" he asked softly. "A man like me don't know much about love or family." She met his gaze, steady and true. "You know how to care, how to fight, and how to protect. That's more than most men ever learn." He exhaled, a long, trembling breath. Then he reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Guess I can learn the rest." The months that followed were filled with quiet laughter, long evenings by the fire, and soft lullabies echoing through the house. Clara no longer called him Mr. Boone. To the twins, he was Papa. And to her, he became the man she had prayed for on that cold night beside a broken wagon, the answer she never expected. One summer morning, the townsfolk gathered at the little white chapel on the hill. The air was warm, filled with birdsong and the smell of wildflowers. Clara stood at the altar in a simple dress, her hands trembling in Garrett's massive ones. When the preacher spoke the final words, Garrett's deep voice answered steady and sure, "I do." Outside, the twins threw petals into the air, giggling. Miss Annie wiped a tear from her cheek, and the ranch hands cheered. Garrett bent down, lifting both girls into his arms. "My daughters," he said proudly. Clara smiled through her tears. "My husband," she whispered. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara stood on the porch watching the land stretch endlessly before them. Garrett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. The twins slept inside, their soft breathing the only sound. "You ever think about that night?" he asked quietly, "when I found you on the trail?" She nodded. "Every day. I think about how close we came to losing everything and how one man's kindness gave us everything instead." Garrett smiled against her hair. "You saved me too, Clara Mae. You and those girls made me remember what it's like to live." The stars came out one by one, scattered across the velvet sky. The wind carried the scent of rain and the promise of tomorrow. On that wide, quiet land, where once there had been only loneliness and dust, there was now laughter, love, and life. And if you rode past the Boone Ranch at sunrise, you might see a tall man teaching two little girls how to ride ponies while their mother watched from the porch, her smile brighter than the morning sun. Because sometimes, the Lord answers prayers not with miracles from heaven but with a giant rancher on a dusty road who simply says, "You'll come with me." And that was enough to change everything.